So I'm going to talk about the EMC Directive briefly. I often start conversations with potential clients around what legislation is applicable to their machine. And one of the questions in there is around the EMC Directive. Typically it's applicable, if you've got machinery that's got electrical devices in, it's either going to be emitting EMC noise or it's going to have a susceptibility to electrical noise from other machinery. But one of the things that I get into and chat about is the fact that the EMC Directive doesn't mandate testing of your machinery. So I'm going to prove that just by searching testing within the EMC Directive, and we get one result. What is that result? Well, it's talking about conformity assessment bodies. It's just giving a definition. It means a body that performs conformity assessment activities, including collaboration, testing, certification, and inspection. And there's no other searches, or there's no other hit results. So we can go to Annex I, and this is the essential requirements of the EMC Directive. So general requirements: equipment shall be so designed and manufactured having regard to the state of the art as to ensure that A, the electromagnetic disturbance generated does not exceed the level above which radio and telecommunications equipment or other equipment cannot operate as intended. So this is its emissions. And B, it has a level of immunity to the electromagnetic disturbance to be expected in its intended use, which allows it to operate without unexpected degradation of its intended use. And number 2, specific requirements for fixed installations. So this is explicitly for particular machinery, so fixed installations. Installation and intended use of components. A fixed installation shall be installed applying good engineering practices and respecting the information on the intended use of its components with a view to meet the essential requirements set out in point 1. And the reason point 2 is actually noted in here is if you do need to do some sort of testing, well, it's recognizing that a fixed installation is potentially going to be difficult to actually do some EMC testing around. Either, one, you can't fit it in a test facility, or 2, you've got it in an environment where it's likely that there's a lot of other EMC noise. So realistically, doing reliable testing is very limited. So that's why that's there. So obviously, if we have novel equipment, if we have equipment that is going to generate an amount of EMC and it's going to require some sort of testing like it hasn't been assessed before, then under that scenario, you're going to need to do EMC testing, probably. But under a scenario where you are procuring items which are already CE marked, which have already got test data from or that complies with the EMC Directive, we can look at a different route. We can go down the route of doing a electromagnetic compatibility assessment. And that is a paper-based exercise. It's desk-based, so we don't need to do any actual testing. So this isn't as costly. So what does that look like? So we've got Annex II here. We're looking at Module A. So this is internal production control. So here we've got electromagnetic compatibility assessment. So the manufacturer shall perform an electromagnetic compatibility assessment of the apparatus on the basis of the relevant phenomena, with a view to meet the essential requirements set out in point 1 of Annex 1, which we've just looked at. The electromagnetic compatibility assessment shall take into account all the normal intended operating conditions where the apparatus is capable of taking different configurations. The electromagnetic compatibility assessment shall confirm whether the apparatus meets the essential requirements set out in point 1 of Annex 1 in all the possible configurations identified by the manufacturer as representative of its intended use. So what does this look like? How do we justify that? So technical documentation. So the manufacturer shall establish the technical documentation. The documentation shall make it possible to assess the apparatus conformity to the relevant requirements and shall include an adequate analysis and assessment of the risks. So what we can do there is we can have a look at the individual components that the machinery is made up of. As long as we have identified suitable harmonized standards with regard to the EMC Directive, we can then look at those and we can say, have they been tested suitably? Do they suitably comply with the requirements of those harmonized standards? And we can do an assessment based on that. If we're not introducing any novel electrical systems, anything that's particularly going to put out a high amount of electrical noise. And we can make the assumption that those components are compliant and therefore the assembly itself is also compliant. So the other thing that I just wanted to touch on is the scope. So there are some things that are excluded from the scope of the EMC directive, and that is actually things that are benign as well. So this directive shall not apply to, and I'm going to go down to 2D, equipment, the inherent nature of the physical characteristics of which is such, great language, it is incapable of generating or contributing to electromagnetic emissions which exceed a level allowing radio and telecommunication equipment and other equipment to operate as intended, and it operates without unacceptable degradation in the presence of the electromagnetic disturbance normally consequent upon its intended use. So what does that mean? So there is an EMC guide, which is freely available, and I've just flicked down to inherently benign equipment. So what is inherently benign equipment? So equipment that is inherently benign in terms of EMC, so electromagnetic compatibility, is excluded from the scope of the EMC directive. So that's section 23 down here, so article 2, 2D, which we were just looking at. So let's have a look at some of the examples of what that actually covers. So the application of the above, which is from the EMC directive, which we just read out, enables the exclusion of the following products, not exclusive, from the application of the EMC directive, provided that they include no active electronic parts. So some of the things that are interesting in here are induction motors without electronic circuits, equipment containing only resistive loads without any automatic switching devices. So their example here is domestic heaters with no controls, thermostats, or fans. And we've also got electromagnetic relays without active electronic parts, or electromagnetic locks without any active electronic parts. So if you've got a very simple piece of equipment, or it's made up of a number of CE marked components, and maybe you're introducing another item of equipment, which is one of these listed here, that would put you in a position that excludes you from requiring any sort of testing. And you could viably assess it from a desktop process. You could assess it by looking at the documentation that is supplied with the CE marked equipment that you have. You could also then conclude that the parts that you've included into the machinery are benign because they're in this list, or they're very similar to equipment that is in this list. And therefore you could state in your assessment that your machinery meets the requirements of the EMC directive without having to do any testing. Now, I hope that's provided some clarity on the applicability and how we apply the EMC directive to machinery.